Life in prison for the man they call the Butcher of Bosnia. The Balkans' most notorious military commander is found guilty of genocide. I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is Ratko Mladic. Ratko Mladic's trial is the last at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. After 24 years, it's to be disbanded now that it's put dozens of war criminals in prison. Mladic is among the worst offenders. Judges found him guilty on a number of charges, including the genocide of Bosnian Muslims in Srebrenica, where more than 8,000 men and boys were slaughtered in 1995. Mladic will now most likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. But what does the verdict mean for the victims' families? Will they find closure? And will his prosecution now make it easier for other war criminals to be brought to justice? That debate in a moment, but first this report by Natalie Perhonen.
The man known as the Butcher of Bosnia, Ratko Mladic, at first appeared relaxed on what would become a historic day. But after an outburst...
Mr. Mladic, if you continued like this...
He was ordered to leave and wasn't present to hear the verdict. He was found guilty at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia of 10 counts, including genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes.
For having committed these crimes, the chamber sentences Mr. Ratko Mladic to life imprisonment.
These women have waited for more than 20 years for justice for their relatives. The tribunal found the Bosnian Serb army commander significantly contributed to the genocide in Srebrenica. Still, many Serbs see him as a war hero, but this verdict will forever define his role in history as a perpetrator of what the court calls some of the most heinous crimes known to humankind. This is footage from one day in the Balkan War. It was shot on August 28, 1995. 2 shells hit the center of Sarajevo in the morning. More than 30 people were killed and at least 60 others were wounded. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was set up to deal with the atrocities committed during the conflict in the 1990s.
A case of violation of the laws or customs of war.
It was the first war crimes court created by the UN. Its decisions have set precedents on genocide, crimes against humanity, and recognizing sexual violence as a war crime. It has also given the world an extensively documented history of the war. More than 4,500 witnesses have testified, and 2.5 million pages of transcripts have been generated. The tribunal has indicted 161 individuals. The former president of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, was brought to The Hague, but died during his trial. Former Bosnian Serb leader Radovan Karadzic was convicted of several crimes, including genocide, and sentenced to 40 years in prison. The court has come under criticism from some Serbs, though. They argue prosecutors have mostly targeted Serbian suspects and not Croats and Bosnian Muslims. The tribunal was supposed to help with reconciliation in the former Yugoslavia, but even its chief prosecutor acknowledges the difficulties in achieving that.
As long as you have in Bosnia 3 different history books used by the Serbian, Croatian or Bosnian community with a totally different assessment about not only the wars but the last 200 years, well, if the society cannot agree on a joint history, how do you want to move forward?
The tribunal closes in December, but what will be its legacy after seeking justice for victims for more than 20 years? Natalie Perhonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now is Nerma Jelagic. She's the former spokeswoman for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. In Belgrade, we have Darko Trifunovic. He's a former advisor to the State Secretary for War Crimes of Bosnia and Herzegovina and a former First Secretary of the Foreign Service at the UN. And at The Hague, we have Nevenka Tromp. She's the author of Prosecuting Slobodan Milosevic, The Unfinished Trial. She's also a lecturer on Eastern European Studies at the University of Amsterdam. I thank you all for joining us. Nevenka Tromp, let me begin with you. Has justice been served?
Yes, the justice has been served, but with the explanation that the legal justice is nothing else than determination by the judges if individual has found guilty of the charges as charged in the indictment. And this is something that outside world and non-lawyers very often fail to understand. And this sort of justice as produced by these sort of international criminal tribunals will be always limited because the starting point of justice system is always what is being charged in the indictment.
Right. Nerma, are you happy by this announcement? Guilty of genocide, guilty on all counts, barring one. Is it something you've been through the process? It's been a painstaking process. Does this verdict give you joy?
It's a good judgment. Genocide, crimes against humanity, including extermination, persecution, murders. It has taken a long time, but the final conclusions of the trial chamber here are not surprising. In any case, for anyone, legal mind or non-legal mind, who has been following this trial, in a way, a lot of things that have been found in prior judgments and prior cases in front of the tribunal have been confirmed here in the Mladic judgment, and of course with the added value that his own individual criminal responsibility has been ascertained now beyond reasonable doubt. He got life sentence. It's unfortunate that he didn't stay in the courtroom to hear it live, so to speak, but he got his comeuppance. It took 20 years, but the final message today is justice is possible. It might take time, but it is possible.
Darko, the other two guests believe that justice is possible. You can't say that the ICTY wasn't thorough. They heard from 591 witnesses and examined nearly 10,000 exhibits concerning 106 separate crimes. With all of that in mind, do you accept that this has been a just decision?
Well, first of all, I don't know which kind of justice is served. We have taken in mind that Haramush Haranidaj was released. Ante Gotovina, he was sentenced as Ratko Mladic in the first trial, in the first, let's say, sentence. He was accused and then he was released later on. There was no sentence against Milosevic, no sentence against Franjo Tudjman, no sentence against Alija Izetbegovic. So we have no sentence against main player in this bloody civil war in Bosnia. I coming from the family of the victims. My family was the one of the first victim in Bosnia in the village of Sjekovac when my aunt was raped and no justice up to date. 200 Roma kids were slaughtered and we find out 56 bodies up to date, and Hague Tribunal doesn't want to pick up the case because it's a Roma case.
So, Darko,
the justice is very problematic to me.
Okay, so you might have a case that other people have committed atrocities and you feel they haven't been adequately dealt with, right? You mentioned victims of your family, and nobody's diminishing the pain of Serbs and others. But why can't you say that and at the same time accept that there's overwhelming evidence that this man was responsible for the killing of 8,000 men and boys in Srebrenica, for the siege of Sarajevo in which more than 10,000 Sarajevans were killed? Why can't you say, well, while I feel there's been unfairness elsewhere, the evidence is clear that Ratko Mladic did unspeakable things in the name of the Bosnian Serbs during the Balkans War? Why does it have to be one or the other?
Because of the American prosecutor, he introduced this, let's say, using a RICO statute for criminal organization and labeling through Ratko Mladic case all Serbian people, not only in Bosnia. So that's why this is a very sad day. I feel very sympathy for all family of the victims because I feel sympathy to Muslims and Croatians that they lose their beloved ones. But also I lost mine and there is no justice. So I need to repeat you, this kind of the evidence presented by trial does not directly pointed out to Ratko Mladic as an individual. And International Criminal Tribunal work with individual responsibility. So they create this kind of collective responsibility using a RICO statute. And this is illegal now. It's a matter for legal, let's say, legal thinkings, etc., for our colleague lawyers. But the thing is now we have one side in Bosnia. We have pictures that only Bosnian Serbs commit atrocities. And we have a case of Izetbegovic, who was a son in concentration camp.
You believe justice has been unfair
that they were raped there.
Okay, Nerma, you're shaking your head in disagreement. Tell me why.
Well, I shake my head in disagreement with a number of assertions of your guest from Belgrade. Of course, the issue of or the accusation of this judgment convicting a whole nation is absolutely incorrect. As you could have heard, Chief Prosecutor Brammertz, after this judgment, he of course knew that there would be voices who would be claiming that, as these voices have been saying that for the last 20 years, that the tribunal is convicting nations and the whole people, and this is not true. The only person at the end of the day who stays in the jail is Ratko Mladic. The issue of what Darko Trifunovic calls RICO statute is the issue of joint criminal enterprise, which is not in any way a shocking application of the law. It was applied in the tribunal. It is being applied under different name and under different modalities in other international courts. But of course, this is not a judgment against the Serbian people. This is judgment against one man, the leader of the Bosnian Serb military, and the role and the power that he held over those structures that wreaked havoc and committed the crimes across the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina for 3.5 years. Granted, there are other crimes committed, of course, by all sides in the conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina in particular. And not everyone has been charged, not everyone has been convicted for that matter, but that doesn't mean that the buck stops with the tribunal. This is an international court that indicted 161 people. This is unheard of. But this work does not stop in The Hague. It does not stop with this judgment. The work continues in the Belgrade court, in Sarajevo court, and elsewhere. And all of us whose families suffered, which crimes were not part of the Mladic indictment or any other indictment for that matter, could indeed continue working for that justice and demanding this justice be done and continues to be done in front of the national courts.
Nevenka, Nerma said that this work does not stop at The Hague. Let's sort of take a broad view of international justice, because the whole concept of modern international justice was sort of spawned by the Balkans War, 22 years on from the end of the war, and given that at the end of the year we're seeing the ICTY wind up, there's been a lot of criticism regarding the ICTY. As we heard from Darko, there's been a lot of criticism of the sister court, the ICC, in the past few years. Let me ask you a broad question, Nevenka. Has this experiment in international justice worked or failed?
There is not one simple answer to that. I think it was a very noble endeavor, and I think it was absolutely needed and worthy of trying. It was unfortunate situation that there was hardly any reference point for tribunal and Rwanda tribunal that were founded shortly after the ICTY, Yugoslavia tribunal. So many of these practices, as we see it now, were done almost learning by doing it. And of course, there were some shortcomings, some serious shortcomings, but there were also very important achievements. But what we now see, that it would be interesting to see whether all these best practices that tribunal has achieved, Yugoslavia and Rwanda tribunals, can be safely transformed to the permanent international criminal justice, criminal court here in The Hague. And there are serious doubts where this permanent court actually will have a long life. But to explain what I exactly mean by that, I would like to go back to the discussion that was started by Mr. Trifunovic, and to refer to the fact that this notion that Yugoslavia Tribunal does so-called prosecute and try individuals, but basically seeking to reflect it as a collective responsibility or criminality of a people, and in his case, as he explained it to Serbian people, is interesting, but because in the debate I've been following as someone who worked at the tribunal now from a scholarly point of view, this notion has been introduced in discussion by Serbs themselves. Do not forget that when Milosevic came to The Hague and opened his own case, he said, I'm not his individual, my whole people is on the trial. There was an interesting notion that Serbs always insist on collective responsibility, and we who work for tribunal, who observe it now, we know that this tribunal can go only so far to determine, even not innocence of someone, but to determine if someone has been found guilty as charged on the indictment. And to connect again this point with something Mr. Trifunovic said, that Ramush Haradinaj has been acquitted, General Gotovina has been acquitted. He, of course, omitted to mention that General Momčilo Perišić has been acquitted. But in a Serb interpretation of justice, whatever and whoever is acquitted who comes from Serbia, they find that it is justice. And if someone is acquitted that belongs to other nationality, on the other army or political corpus, Serbs would say it is injustice.
Okay, so let's ask Darko about that.
Cherry-picking by Serbian side.
Good point. Okay, so Darko, let me ask you, how come when your guys are acquitted, okay, the judges are fine and the court is fair, but when it's Croats or Bosniaks, suddenly the court is unfair? At the heart of it, isn't it true that many Bosnian Serbs and many people within Serbia itself have just failed to reconcile with the crimes that were committed more than 2 decades ago in their name? They're not responsible for it, but they're failing to recognize that bad things were done by people claiming to represent them.
Of course, we have many issues now. This is a good debate, but you need to have in mind, I was the Serb representative during the Rome Conference 1998 when International Criminal Court were established. So ICTY and ICTR practice was almost refused. Rule of procedure, statutes, everything is not incorporated in the ICC. Why? Something is wrong. So we cannot talk like this. So if some of Serbs like Momčilo Perišić, who was a minor relating to Gotovina and Ramush Haradinaj, is released, and there was not his engagement like in Gotovina case. I will give you just, I prepared indictment for Gotovina, and he was not even prosecuted for the crime in Mrkonjić Grad, and colleague from ICTY know what I'm talking about. So there is still open wounds, and there is still picture that ICTY is a completely political bodies, and that best practice of ICTY and ICTR was not accepted by international criminal law, actually is not accepted by International Criminal Court, which was established in 1998 in Rome.
Nerma, given that Mladic was the biggest fish among many, and this trial in a way sort of puts a button on going after all these major generals and commanders in the Bosnian War, we've seen pictures over the past 24 hours of mothers, of wives, of sisters, of children, of people who were killed in Srebrenica and elsewhere. Is this conviction going to provide closure for those people?
Well, that's always a difficult question. I think for a long time, for over 2 decades, we, by which I don't mean only people from Bosnia and former Yugoslavia, but in general, proponents of international criminal justice believed that the impact of these judgments could be much bigger outside of the courtroom than the reality shows us is the case. I believe today's judgment is a just judgment insofar as it correctly applied the law to the evidence that has been presented. Will that be enough for the victims is a question for each victim individually. From what I have seen from the statements so far, most of the victims who were there in The Hague and those watching back at their homes in Bosnia were satisfied with what they could hear, but they said this, of course, does not bring back our dead. So the question then is, how much can criminal justice, how much can these trials by themselves and alone contribute to a reconciliation of the people?
It's a massive day for the entire region. Ratko Mladic convicted. The judge, Alphonse Ori, saying Mladic's crimes rank among the most heinous known to humankind and include genocide and extermination. Unfortunately, I've got to move on. So Nevenka Trump, Darko Trifunovic and Nerma Jelagic, I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers. Bye-bye. Still ahead on the Newsmakers, Cairo plays host to Palestinian unity talks. Could Hamas and Fatah's bitter rivalry finally be coming to an end? And is a Saudi Arabian blockade of Yemen stopping organizations from sending in humanitarian aid? We'll get both sides of the story. Welcome back to the Newsmakers. Bitter rivals for more than a decade. But could the two biggest Palestinian factions finally be coming together? Representatives from Hamas and Fatah have gathered in Cairo. Their aim? To form a unified government. Last month, they signed a deal where Hamas agreed to concede civil power to the Palestinian Authority. Everything looked to be on track as they handed over control of Gaza's Egyptian border crossing. But since then, progress has stalled, making these talks all the more crucial. Vanessa Keneally explains.
For the better part of 10 years, they haven't been able to get along. Now they've been invited to Cairo, a delegation made up of rival Palestinian factions. Hamas and Fatah all meeting to achieve what President Mahmoud Abbas has called one law, one weapon, under one authority. The talks on Tuesday are the latest in a series of meetings aimed at ending a deadly division. And so far they seem to be working. Last month, Hamas agreed to hand over control of the Gaza Strip's border crossing with Egypt. It's now being run by the Palestinian Authority led by Fatah for the first time in a decade. It's a historic agreement that's already improved the lives of many Palestinians.
I have been waiting for this day when I can cross the border and go to an eye specialist, because here in Gaza we don't have the treatment needed for my eyes. I ask from God and the government to keep the crossing open so I can go to receive my treatment and come back home to my family and my home.
Tens of thousands of people hope peace between Hamas and Fatah will turn around years of having to endure a low standard of living.
I hope that the siege will finish, so there will be job opportunities for people and they will be able to support their families.
But the next phase of talks between Hamas and Fatah might not be so straightforward. Control over Hamas's security forces has been one of the trickiest issues facing the two sides. The suggestion by those brokering the talks is the creation of a National Security Council where Hamas and the Palestinian Authority will have equal representation. It would be monitored by Egyptian officials who would cast the deciding vote in the case of a tie. But on the ground, some are sceptical whether that idea will actually work.
It's impossible. How can I do security when there is all these rockets and guns and whatever? Is this possible? It doesn't work.
Palestinians in Gaza and the occupied West Bank have been ruled separately since fighting between Hamas and Fatah broke out in 2007 after Fatah lost control in elections. Back then, the two sides had agreed to form a coalition, but Hamas seized Gaza by force and set up a rival government, leaving Fatah and the Palestinian Authority running parts of the West Bank not under Israeli control. That continued until 2014, when a deal was reached but never properly implemented. So could this meeting in Cairo mean reconciliation at last? Can those representing many different political agendas finally come together and define one kind of future? All in time for December the 1st deadline. Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Ramallah by Abdullah Abdullah. He's the head of the political committee of the Palestinian Legislative Council. In London, we have Sharif Nashashibi. He's a Palestinian journalist and commentator on Arab affairs. And also from London, we have Azam Tamimi. He's an author of several books on Hamas. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Abdullah Abdullah, let me begin with you first, sir, in Ramallah. We've seen this movie before. It's ended in a false dawn every time the two came together for reconciliation talks. Why should we believe that it's going to work this time around?
It's different.
Why?
Different on three accounts. Number one, the challenges that the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian people are facing from both the occupiers of our land, the Israelis, and some attempts from the international community, basically United States of America, who is trying to find a solution, but we don't believe that solution will be fair and will meet the minimum of the requirements of our people. So in the face of all these challenges, we need to be one, strong, united, and solid in our defending our national rights. Second, I think the situation in Gaza is miserable, especially at the daily life of the Palestinians, due to the siege that was forced on our people there by the Israeli occupiers of our land. And this, of course, requires all forces of Palestine should come together and try to at least lessen the hardships, the suffering of our people there. Thirdly, I believe Egypt is more keen, more forceful in coming back to its leading role in the Arab politics and its special attention, special ties to the Palestine question. Egypt is determined to succeed this time in unifying the Palestinian forces.
I remember when speaking with Hamas in Gaza a few months ago, they were hesitant to criticize Egypt because they felt the Egyptians are going to play a crucial role moving forward with negotiations. Azam Tamimi, do you share the optimism of Abdullah Abdullah that the two sides can finally reconcile this time around?
I'm not sure I am optimistic about all of this. Events in the whole region are so fluid. They change by the minute. And the reasons for reconciliation a month ago are probably different from reasons that people talk about today because of the decision by Saudi Arabia to rush toward making peace with Israel. I think so many things will change. But nevertheless, the main motivation from Hamas' point of view is actually easing the suffering of the people of Gaza. The people of Gaza for more than 10 years have been punished so severely by Israel, by Egypt, and by the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah for having made a choice that the world community at the time did not favor, and because Hamas did not succumb to the quartet conditions. But now Hamas realizes that the people of Gaza cannot take it anymore. Hamas itself is suffering a lot because of the siege and the destruction of the tunnels, the cutting of power, supply, etc. So I think that is really the main motivation from Hamas' point of view.
Okay, let's bring in Sharif Nashashibi. Sharif, speaking to many young Palestinians, they'll tell me, okay, on the one hand, you have one side that believes in resistance no matter what, and they're too extreme for us. And on the other side, you have a group of old politicians who are committed to negotiations and concessions no matter what, and they're too corrupt for us, and we're caught in between the two. Is that how it plays out? Are Palestinians doomed to being caught in the middle of these two forever and ever?
Well, yes, unfortunately, you have these two parties trying to reconcile, but they have very different views, not just on Palestinian governments, but on the self-determination cause. And I haven't seen any evidence yet that they are able to find common ground over these major issues of contention, many of which have been kind of left further down the line, probably in the knowledge that they could scupper these talks very easily. So you have big divergences between the two parties, but also you have the reconciliation process is open to influence from outside parties, some of which don't want Palestinian reconciliation. So you have internal and external challenges, which all in all make young Palestinians not particularly optimistic. We've certainly had false starts over the last 10 years, and I don't see yet that this will be any different.
Right. Azam Tamimi, as we drill down into the details, it's one thing Hamas saying, okay, we need to be pragmatic and maybe give up control of Gaza because our people are going to suffer and die. It's another thing to say, okay, we want a unity government. What if being a part of that unity government means Hamas has to then blink, has to cave in, has to, for example, recognize Israel based on the 67 borders? Is that a reality? Is that something we're going to see going forward?
Well, that's a concern people have. So far, I don't see a sign of Hamas caving in this way, although it has caved in some other ways, in giving control over certain issues in Gaza. But recognizing Israel's legitimacy, I don't think we will see this. And if Hamas were to do this, so what's the difference between Hamas and Fatah?
Right.
The Palestinians will be looking for something new afterwards. Because the very sad thing about the Palestinian issue is that their original nationalist movement, their national liberation movement, decided to give up the struggle for the liberation of the whole of Palestine. But this is a dream that every Palestinian cherishes, and Palestinians will continue to tell their children and grandchildren that Israel is a colonial project, an illegitimate entity, and one day we will have all of Palestine freed again.
Abdullah, tell me how this would work. Can you tell me honestly that you could see Mahmoud Abbas, for example, in charge of the Qassam brigades? Is that going to play out in reality?
First of all, let me point out that I am not satisfied. I do not accept your characterization of the Palestinian sides as one for resistance, the other for caving in or succumbing to the Israeli dictator. That's not true.
No, fair enough. I was summing up what a lot of young Palestinians have told me. So this is based on about 13 years of scooping up opinion.
Well, 13 or 10 or 50 or 70 or 100. The Palestinian leadership, still the defender of the Palestinian national rights, its movement, its activities, its struggle by all means to regain our national rights and to end the Israeli occupation of our land. It doesn't mean that if we do not practice armed struggle openly as we did in the early 30 years of our movement, doesn't mean that we condemned or we abandoned that. But rather, we choose the most appropriate way of struggling, of fighting for our rights and challenging the occupiers of our land. And we never stop that. We will never stop it. It's our sacred right to choose what is good for our people and for our future. That's one. And about, of course, if we were to go back to where we should be as one united force, Palestinian force, of course, the leader of that movement, the leader of that state, which we have to say that we are recognized as a state that must be in charge of everything. Of course, we have divided three different powers, the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. But after all, the head of our country, the head of our government, he will be in charge of all the powers that serve the regain of our rights.
Okay, Sharif, you want to come in, Sharif?
I do. Look, Abdullah, with all due respect here, you know, we can legitimately debate the efficacy of armed struggle in this particular situation, but the Palestinian Authority continues to coordinate on security issues with Israel, the occupying power. And I mean, I worry that you underestimate how angry this makes Palestinians, particularly younger generations, where they see that the Palestinian Authority is basically a subcontractor of the occupation. It's one thing to say, well, armed struggle won't achieve our goals, but to actually cooperate with the occupying power, this causes a great deal of anger. And I think that the Palestinian Authority and the older elites need to be aware of how much anger this raises. And this is one of those major issues that could easily scupper the deal, because for the last 10 years, much of the security coordination has been targeted at Hamas. So what happens now, if you have a reconciliation agreement, what happens with that security coordination? How does it affect Palestinians on the ground? You cannot ignore that reality.
Abdullah, you want to come back?
Yes. Listen, don't forget that we are still under occupation. We never claim that we are free, as some might. Then, in this case, there were some conditions as an outcome of the Oslo Agreement, which we tried to get rid of. But in the meantime, that didn't stop us from following the Israelis everywhere, from the International Criminal Court in The Hague to the United Nations Security Council to other fora, that we try to establish ourselves on the international scene and make sure that the countries who are recognizing Palestine as a state, it came because of a continued struggle on the part of the Palestinians. And the BDS campaign is another way of fighting the Israelis. You cannot ignore these facts.
I'm not ignoring them, but you cannot tell me that security coordination, look, that clearly benefits Israel. I have yet to see any benefit to the Palestinians of the Palestinian Authority coordinating with their occupying power. This is BDS and all that, that's all well and true, but there are no benefits to the Palestinians.
Certainly. And there are many Palestinians who believe that coordinating with the occupation enforces the occupation. I'm going to park that aside for the moment. I want to kind of go back to Cairo now with Azam Tamimi in London. The talks taking place in Cairo. The major whopper from the outside is going, if these talks are so important and if this is finally going to be the moment of unity, where's Abbas? Where's Ismail Haniyeh? Where are the two main leaders? Why aren't they at the talks? Is that a fair question?
Well, it's really, I don't know the answer to this question. I can only guess that these are the guys in Cairo are discussing technical issues. Probably the top leaders will come for the actual crowning of the agreement if it is ever reached.
How would you like the agreement to unfold? What would you like to be in the text for you to say, okay, here's a good deal that can lead to a viable Palestinian state? Azam?
Well, what I like, I don't think we will see. But at first, I'd like to see the suffering of the people of Gaza come to an end. That humanitarian catastrophe has actually derailed the struggle of our people. Now, for Hamas even, the focus has become Gaza only, which is very wrong. And I've criticized the Hamas leaders for having been absorbed so much by the catastrophe in Gaza. But I don't blame them. I mean, when your children cannot have access to medical care, when you don't have clean water, when you don't have electricity, when you cannot leave this open prison, life is really miserable.
Abdullah, would you like to see fresh elections after an agreement, once there's a unity government? Yeah?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Listen, democracy was one of the cornerstones of our political life in the Palestinian national movement since its inception. And the division, really, it's held back our practicing this right. And the minute we reconcile, I think the first step is, and it is under discussion in Cairo these days, or these hours probably, it is holding elections, both presidential and parliamentary, in order to go back to the people, and the people will decide who will lead them in the next phase of our struggle.
Okay, Sharif Nashashibi, very finally, the UN's Middle East envoy, saying that reconciliation talks must succeed, warning that failure will most likely result in another devastating conflict. That's Nikolai Mladinov. Is he saying something that makes sense, or is he maybe just exaggerating to encourage the two sides?
Well, it is stating the obvious to say that you know, these reconciliation talks must succeed, but that's different from whether they will succeed. And I brought up the issue earlier of external challenges. We've just talked now about Palestinian elections and about Gaza. Now, both of those things are not in the hands of the Palestinians themselves. The blockade of Gaza is up to Israel and Egypt. It's not in the Palestinians' hand. And Palestinian elections can be easily scuppered by Israel, which is the occupying power. It has meddled in elections before. It has said that it will not deal with any government that includes Hamas. So Israel holds the cards in terms of Palestinians being able to campaign and cast votes, and Israel and Egypt hold the cards in terms of lifting the blockade of Gaza. Whether the Palestinians reconcile or not will not necessarily fix those problems.
Okay, we'll be watching those talks closely in Egypt, looking for an announcement, and hopefully anything that comes out of it will ease the suffering of the people, particularly those under blockade. It's been good to talk to all of you, Abdullah, Sharif Nashashibi and Azam Tamimi. Thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers.
We at the UN are calling on the Saudi-led coalition to reopen the land, sea and airports in Yemen and allowing the commercial and aid movement to how it was. We also called on all the parties of the conflict in Yemen to respect international humanitarian law and to respect their duties under the umbrella of that.
Several UN agencies are calling on Saudi Arabia to fully lift its blockade on Yemen. The World Health Organization, the World Food Programme and UNICEF all say even though Riyadh reopened some air and sea ports this week, it's not enough. The kingdom argues its actions are warranted and prevent weapons from reaching Houthi rebels. But a United States agency says the Saudis are risking a famine that could kill thousands of civilians. And humanitarian workers say their aid cannot get into the country. Well, with me here in the studio to discuss this is Dr. Najib Saeed Ghanim. He used to be Yemen's health minister and is now a member of Al-Islah, a Yemeni opposition party that supports Saudi Arabia. And joining us from Amman is Caroline Anning. She's the Yemen advocacy manager at the NGO Save the Children. Thanks both of you for joining us. Najib Ghanim, to begin with, those aid agencies are right, aren't they? Open it up so we can get to help these people. I mean, the numbers are staggering of people who are starving, people who need food aid, people who are vulnerable to cholera. Why not open it up?
Yeah, thanks, really. I admit that there is so many problems in Yemen now, and there is huge crisis. But really, the main cause of this crisis is the coup. Let me just remind you about some facts that coup militias, Houthi, precisely speaking, the Houthi militias, they are just put their hands on the public funds, on the salaries of the people. And they also, captured huge quantity of food coming from outside. And as I said before, just put it in their own stores and resell it again in the black markets.
But the Red Cross, the World Food Programme, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, and MSF, and we're going to hear from Save the Children now, yes, they're saying our aid's not going to the Houthis, our aid's going to the people. So what are you talking about?
To be honest, really, so many reports came from inside Yemen, especially those areas who are under the control of the Houthi militias. And some of these reports really are either exaggerated, the phenomena, or biased. Those people, really, the coup people, Houthi people, are highly tricky people. And they can also manipulate in these things. But really, I admit,
so you want the blockade to continue?
No, I'm not speaking about blockade. Inside Yemen, there is huge food now, but nobody can buy it because there is no money. People are starving because they lost their own public money. Public revenue, public money, central bank, all under the captured by Houthis. And they stolen these monies and left people very poor, very starving. This is the main problem.
Let me ask Caroline. Okay, well, hold on. Let me bring in Caroline Anning. Caroline, is the blockade hampering your work?
Absolutely. Yes. And I think it's really important to counter this argument that if you bring humanitarian aid in, it doesn't get where it's needed. There is absolutely no doubt that the Houthis and all parties to the conflict make it difficult for us to do our work, sometimes impede aid delivery. But we are very clear that we get the aid to where it's needed, that our staff identify the families that need it and deliver it to those families. And so the blockade that's happening at the moment is having a catastrophic impact. It's having a huge impact on our ability and other aid agencies' ability to deliver. Right now, we have just about enough stockpiled, but that will start to run out soon. Our staff are either trapped in Sana'a or lots of us, including me, can't get back in. And at the same time, prices are rising fast on the market. They're going up by 15, 20, 30%. Water is running out in some places. And that's pushing families who are already on the breadline into starvation, essentially. They're having to decide whether to buy clean water or whether to buy bread to feed their children day after day. And we're expecting to see rates of severe acute malnutrition and child deaths to go up as a result.
Caroline, do you believe that the blockade is collectively punishing Yemenis?
I think there's two ways to look at the term collective punishment. There's the legal definition of collective punishment, which is being worked out at the moment, whether that's what's being met, and that's certainly a possibility. But you can argue, are Yemenis, Yemeni civilians, Yemeni children being punished for the sins of armed groups who are fighting? Absolutely, yes. That is what we are unfortunately seeing on the ground, have been seeing throughout this conflict, but are seeing even more so now with this blockade, which feels, amid the world's worst humanitarian crisis, very cruel to be turning back 29 ships that have been cleared by the UAID, carrying huge quantities of food and fuel that were needed. Stocks of medicines, flights of vaccines are being literally turned back at the borders of Yemen from children who need them. And I just don't believe, we don't believe as Save the Children, the aid community doesn't believe that there's any justification for that. We need to be able to separate out the politics on the ground from the humanitarian need.
Okay, Najib, so Caroline's saying there's no justification for that. Tell me in a sentence, what's your justification for that?
As I said before, Emily, we admit that there is a problem, but the main cause of this problem that the people have stolen their money, their own public money have been stolen by the Houthi militias, and they left them poor. Those Houthi militias before the war, they were very poor.
They stole it.
Hang on.
Okay, even if it's true, they stole it. The Houthis have all the food. People don't have the food. There is food, they don't have it. They need to get food from somewhere. Why is the coalition sending back those ships? Why can't they let it come in?
For example, Aden Shipport is open now. It's not under the blockade, and ships are coming.
Why are we having this conversation?
People, they haven't got money.
Why did the World Food Programme, UNICEF, World Health Organization, why is Caroline on the show here if the ports are open?
They are asking for money coming from outside just to get this money to buy food. But to be honest, really, they just, left those people, they don't care about the people. Why the international community, media, why they don't focus on the main crime made by the Houthis?
But we have. But that's the thing.
I've
had Houthi spokesmen on, we've spoken about them.
Really
We're talking about the blockade now. We're talking about aid groups wanting to send aid in, food and medicine, to the millions of people who are starving and in need, people who are suffering medically and otherwise. And the Saudi-led blockade, the Saudis have called it a blockade, I've not made up this term, is not letting them in. So I'm saying, okay, fine, blame the Houthis to the ends of the earth. They caused this. But why the blockade? Fine, the Houthis are tricky, but why the blockade? Why let your own people starve to death and die from cholera?
Since the starting of the coup, the Saudis paid at least $7 billion helping Yemen, covering food and drugs and other things, really. Most of this money either buying, commodities like, for example, food and all these things, and as I said, captured by the Houthi and just sell it in the black markets. So there is food inside Yemen. There is but there is no money.
Okay, let me ask you this question. The World Food Programme says 150,000 malnourished children are at risk of dying in the coming months. In trying to stop your Yemeni children from dying, Save the Children are trying to help. There's Caroline. She wants to get into Yemen in order to help stop the deaths of these children. Speak to her. Tell her how she can help.
Yes, she can help. She just speak loudly that the cause of this famine, if there is a famine,
what do you want the Houthis? You want her to criticize the Houthis. She wants to feed starving children in Yemen.
I think there is Marib gates between Marib and Saudi border are open. Shipboards in Aden are open. Mukalla is open, but there is no money. This is the problem. And they won't ask Saudi to pay money. They have been before so many money, but have been stolen.
Okay,
nobody said that this money have been stolen by the Houthis.
How does the Save the Children get aid into the country?
Yes, I admit there is no there is blockade of this system, sanitation system. There is no that pure water for the people, and there is
how do they get aid?
Yes, we have to, for example, speaking loudly that fundraising, local, regional, also international. But the main cause
they have funds. They want to get the food in. How do they get in?
No, I don't think that it's a blockade. It's a blockade against weapons. But for the food, it's okay. I can tell you something. They can, if there is food, if there is money, there is huge food inside by the traders. They can buy it from inside.
I think we're going around in circles here. Caroline, according to Najib, there are ways to get in right now. Is that true?
It's definitely true that they have now opened up access to southern Yemen, so to the ports of Aden, to the airport in Aden, and that's great. And we as Save the Children are working across the country. I think it's really important to emphasize that we're a neutral humanitarian organization and we're there to go wherever the greatest need is. But the reality is that the vast majority of imports come through the port of Hodeidah, which is in the north and is currently shut off. Aden port can't replace that in any sense. So we're not going to be able to get the quantity of food that we need in through those southern ports. And it's not safe to travel the road between Aden and Sana'a. So if we bring aid into Aden, we can't bring it to the north. And the north is where the most populated area, is where some of the areas of greatest humanitarian need is, where children, huge areas on the brink of famine. And I think it's important to say that that's in the north and the south. So even in areas that are being run by the government of Yemen, are managed so chaotically with so much corruption across the country, as we say, this is an issue, the doctor's absolutely right, this is an issue across the country, that there's also children starving in those areas. So we absolutely have to have all ports open so that we can access all areas of the country. And I think also you are absolutely right that there is food in the country and people are not able to buy it. That's certainly true in some areas and to some extent. That's because partly public sector salaries haven't been paid, which is again something we would really ask the government of Yemen and the central bank to look at doing, to pay public sector salaries so that people can feed their own children. But the reality is we are where we are. People don't have the money to pay for it. People are completely devastated by years of war and economic crisis. And so we have to be able to get there. If we're not there to run the hospitals, to run food programs, to feed the 27,000 severely, acutely malnourished children who come through the doors, new cases every month.
I've got to move on, but I think it's important we had this conversation. Caroline Anning and Najib Ghanim, I thank you both for joining us on the Newsmakers. And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, the on-again, off-again resignation of the Lebanese Prime Minister. We ask how Saad Hariri's return to Beirut will impact regional rivalries. Until then, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.